Hey, what's going on? I am Travis with Proselytize or Apostatize, and I am here with my very good friend Ben Watkins. He's with Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast. And so we're going to be kind of discussing, the definition of atheism, how theists and atheists can kind of better communicate and kind of further the dialogue. We're going to be talking about evidence. Like, is there any evidence for theism and things of that sort? So, Ben, great to have you. And if you want to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yes. First off, thanks for inviting me on.
Yeah.
My name's Ben Watkins from Real Atheology, a philosophy of religion podcast, where we explore questions in the philosophy of religion from non-theist perspectives and try to see what sort of religious concepts we can salvage once we've rejected something like theism. And so
Mhm.
we try to explore what sort of future religious concepts might look like, while also trying to engage constructively with the Western Christian tradition here in America, and to try to better forward that conversation in
Yeah.
productive ways, so that theists and atheists can dialogue better, have better
Yeah.
constructive dialogue that everyone can better benefit from, just for their own sake of the nature of the questions.
Yeah, I think you bring up a great point because I mean, so many times there's this wall between like internet atheism, internet theism. There's not really, I don't see a lot of meaningful dialogue, and so what are some ways you think we can kind of further the dialogue between theism and atheism? In constructive ways.
So the first point that I would want to say is that um, atheists can take theists more seriously, without losing anything um, intellectually. So
Hmm.
it does not count against atheists to take theists more serious than they do. And so, what do I mean by that? And so, what I mean by that is that there are serious questions in the philosophy of religion, such that there's, centuries old traditions surrounding these questions that have thought about these questions and have tried to answer these questions in different ways. And there's sophisticated answers on both sides. And some people
Hmm.
think that the question is indeterminate. Some people think that the question falls to one side, and some people think that the
Yeah.
question falls to the other side. And so there's still progress being made. It might be slow, it might be painstaking, it
Hmm.
might be, happening through gritted teeth in a lot of the academy, but there is progress being made in these areas. And I think that we can make progress in this area. And so I hope that one of the things that we can do is concede more ground
Sure.
to theists, just in simple things that um, might not even matter that much in the long run, but do matter for the sake of having a constructive dialogue. Things like the definition of atheism. So
Yeah.
there's a go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was thinking you bring up a really great point because a lot of times I hear the new atheists say there's just no evidence for theism, like none of the arguments work, it's all fallacious. What are your thoughts on that from your perspective? I mean, do you think there are some positive arguments for theism?
Well, so yes, I think there are observations that we can say are evidence for theism rather than evidence for atheism. And
Right.
so, what do I mean by that? Well, it's all going to turn on how we conceive of evidence. And so,
Hmm.
if we say that some observation is evidence for some belief, there's several different things that we might mean by that. And so, on a very common understanding of evidence, some observations can favor a
Hmm.
hypothesis over some other given hypothesis. And so, this is just a likelihood comparison. And so, if
Sure.
I were to say something, like there's, object X has feature F, And this observation is more probable given theism than atheism. That's just one way in which I can say there's evidence for theism. It might be true that this observation
Yeah.
is more probable. Now, that doesn't mean that the hypothesis is true overall. So
Sure.
the
Sure.
the observation that there's noises coming from my attic is evidence that it's evidence that there's gremlins in my attic, but that's a very low, no one thinks that hypothesis that there's gremlins in my attic has a very high probability. So there's a
Yeah.
difference between an observation being evidence given some hypothesis, but it's quite another thing for a hypothesis to be probable given some observation. And so there are
Yeah.
very modest ways in which we can concede to theists, in which we say, yeah, there is evidence for God, but it's not evidence sufficient for belief. That
Right.
we need more evidence, we need better evidence, or there's evidence in the other direction. So if you wanted to be a really constructive interlocutor in a discussion, you could not only offer reasons why you know these arguments are mistaken, but you could also give arguments of your own.
Yeah. From the theist side, I think one way I approach it is I like to kind of form an inference to the best explanation, like keep it modest. And when I look at things like the problem of evil, especially like horrendous suffering, I think sure there are theodicies that can explain it. I think the Molinist approach is a good explanation. I think there's quite a few good explanations for it. But I would kind of concede that I think indifference would be a better, more parsimonious explanation to something like horrendous suffering. So, but then likewise, I think things like the origin of the universe and the fine tuning can be explained by naturalism, but I think theism offers a better explanation for it. And so, I think we need to kind of be more humble and kind of concede where the arguments take us, in to kind of further the dialogue. What do you think about that?
Well, so I would obviously disagree with you some of the implications of the arguments that you mentioned, but that's not very surprising, given the context. But I do think that you're onto something right when you say that there is a conversation to be had here that atheists need to take more seriously. So they can't just naively intuit their way through the landscape of this dialogue. They don't have all the answer. Like to give an example, like there's an entire tradition that tries to answer what the relation God has with time. And I can't tell you how many times I just see atheists just acting like they understand anything about the tradition, about how God is related to time. And you can just tell just how by they, there's several different language games that come along with this dialogue, and you can tell that they're just not familiar with any of them.
Yeah,
And
and
so
but
it's
yeah,
not even that their claims are false, it's just that they're just not even false. They're just not even using the right language to talk in any constructive way about God's relation to time.
yeah, and by the way, I want to welcome Caleb. So glad to have you, bro. And I don't know, do you want to kind of get into like what atheism is? Like is it just a lack of belief? Is it the definition of atheism? Would you want to kind of get into that?
Sure. So
I think that's a really important topic, between the conversations of theism and
absolutely. So,
atheism.
and I think this is obviously one area in which I think atheists can improve, certainly online, because it seems like there's this hill that internet atheists are really willing to die on, and it's this colloquial sense of the term atheist, that where someone to be an atheist is just to lack a belief in God, is
Yeah,
kind of the standard definition that we should use in parlance and in discussions about these topics. But I'm part of a more serious analytical philosophical tradition that more emphasizes things like the rigor of argument and the clarity of concept. And so, no, we want to use a much better definition than this, because if you actually think about the definition that's being offered by the lack theist camp,
Yeah,
it's just really not a useful language game. And
I've
so I
noticed
get
that. Yeah,
so what do I mean by this? I know I'm kind of just dropping some philosophical jargon, so let me kind of
yeah, yeah.
see if I can explicate things here a little bit and make things a little bit more clear. So when I say a language game, I mean that we can understand the meaning of words and phrases by examining this concept of a game. So we all know what a game is, but if we were asked to characterize what a game is, well, do you have to keep score? Well, not all games keep score. Would you have to have a winner and a loser? Well, games like Ring Around the Rosie don't even have winners and losers. So it's really hard to characterize what the necessary and sufficient conditions of a game are. And so language is much like this. There's rules to language that are just kind of unspoken, but when you understand how to use the words, when you understand how to play the game, you might not be able to explain all the rules, but you know that they're there. Because words have their meaning as a result of the rules of the game being played, where these are metaphors for our forms of language and the actions in which they are woven. And so, if we take the language game of lacking a belief, we're in the language game of belief. We're in the language game of psychology. We're talking
Yeah.
about a mental state of someone. And so we're not even in the language game of philosophy of religion. If we're talking about the question, does God exist? That's not a question about anyone's doxaxic attitudes, any of their beliefs, any of their attitudes towards beliefs. It's not any of that. It's an answer to a question that uses a specific kind of concept and that is meant to be what's called cognitivist. It's meant to be a proposition that's true or false. And so I just take the straightforward, everyday, commonsensical way of thinking about atheism is that atheism is the belief that there are no gods. And so we can call that an atheism in a wide sense, and we might say atheism in a narrow sense, in that I believe there is no God. The Western tradition conception of a perfect being that's a single being and is common to the Western Judeo-Christian traditions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism.
Yeah. So,
You could be an atheist in a narrow sense in that you just don't believe that God exists.
would you say that in academia, that the definition of atheism, by and large, is the belief that there are no gods? Would you
Yes,
say
the
that?
belief,
Yeah,
the
that's the
claim, the
academic view.
proposition. Absolutely. There's if you look in the literature, you're not going to find the lack of belief definition anywhere in the academic literature. The closest you will get is Antony Flou's paper in the late 70s, where he tries to argue that atheism is the default position. But I think that it's an actually pretty uncharitable interpretation of that paper to say that Flou thinks that we lack a belief and that should be I don't know how you get that should be the definition of atheism from that paper, but people cite it often online saying that no, this is the gold standard, this is the precedent. And I to me, it's just bad etymology. I don't understand how they get where they're saying they're getting from where they're saying they're getting there from.
Right.
And so I think I have an argument that is just decisively against this lack theist sense. And so,
Yeah.
um,
This would be
and
an area
so,
where I agree with you, definitely. Yeah.
yeah. And so now this argument uses the word should, but it should be
Mhm.
noted that it uses the word should in a rule implying sense. So I'm saying like this is how things should be, the way, rules of etiquette or, the spellings of certain words or the grammar of certain things should be done. So it's not a should in any sort of deeper moral or rational sense. It's a
Right.
should in a rule grammar sense. And so the first claim I say is that atheism should be defined in terms of theism. And so I think that's a pretty fair premise because most people believe that theism is logically prior to atheism. So if we didn't have a concept of theism, there just wouldn't be a need for this concept of atheism. We have the concept of atheism because it's the negation of a concept that's being put forward, theism. So atheism should be defined in terms of theism. The second premise is that theism is best defined as the proposition God exists.
Yeah.
First off, we can't deny this proposition if we think that the question of God's existence can be true or false. If we think that that's the case, there's no avoiding this objection. But even putting that aside, theists get to define what is best, the best way to define theism. Theists all agree that the best way to define theism is that God exists. At least one God exists. Maybe many gods exist. At the very least, all theists agree that the definition of theism should be the proposition that a God exists.
All right. Caleb, what are your thoughts on all this?
Yeah, so I see people are doing comments right now, and we'll get to those in a little bit, so I don't want to offshoot those. But so I joined in a little late here. So I from what I can tell, you're talking about definitions and just the concepts of general academia of theism versus atheism. I guess one thing I was going to ask clarification on, because you mentioned Anthony Flew, and I know he had, I forget this was a paper or book, The Presumption of Atheism. But the idea that, the burden of proof, I think, is on the theists to make their case. And for me, that seems a little bit backward, just because it seems to me that the vast majority of people, both historically and presently, believe in God. And while that doesn't mean that it's true, it does seem to me that like those who are saying that God doesn't exist are the ones who are the outliers, and people kind of just look at them funny, like, well, that's just kind of strange, because I think for most people, and Calvin talked about a sensus divinitatis, and I think modern psychology and neurology has shown that, we have this innate sense to believe in the supernatural for survival reasons. That just seems to be our default position. And I think his name is Justin Barrett, but he's done a lot of work on child psychology of infants and children, and they believe intuitively in agency without even being taught about supernatural concepts. So it seems to me that the idea is more like you have all these people, most of who can see, and you have a couple who are blind, and the blind people may be like, why do all these people think there's light? I can't see anything. And the people who can see light think that their senses are working fine. And so it seems to me like the ones who don't sense this are the ones who are strange, and that the fact that it's a default position should say something. So I don't know if that was coherent as a question, or if that just enlightened anything on the burden of proof, but I guess you can just have his thoughts on that.
Yeah, because we were kind of getting into the burden of proof. So,
so I've laid out two premises for my argument, and the third premise is that the proposition that God exists is not the psychological condition of believing there is a God. So if I say that it's true that there's a proposition that God exists, that doesn't depend on anyone's belief about it. Propositions can be true independent of our beliefs. Those three premises entail the claim that atheism should not be defined as the absence nor lack of the psychological condition of believing that God exists. To me, that's just a straightforward deductive entailment for a just general grammatical rule that we just should not define it that way. And so I think that this is just something we can concede to theists. Atheists don't lose anything theoretically by just conceding this language game to theists. It fits. It works fine. I don't know why we need to make things any more complicated than having these terms: theism, atheism, agnostic, and non-theist. Between those four words, we can cover all the views.
Right, but Ben, I don't think we're talking about definitions. At least with my question, I wasn't trying to get into definitions. I was talking more so
No,
about.
no, you're fine. I was just finishing the.
Oh,
Because
okay.
I was giving an argument. Yeah, I
sorry.
was finishing
I'm
with
sorry.
the last premise. So
Gotcha.
because now I think what's really underlying this lack theist definition of atheism is that there's this game of hide the ball with a burden of justification. It's this idea, well, I'm just lacking a belief, and that I don't have to give justification for the claims I'm making, even though they'll turn right around and make, religion is a delusion. Well, that claim entails that theism is false. And so that claim has a burden of justification. I don't, there is no, I don't, again, within the analytic tradition of philosophy, I really don't like games like that of hide the ball with a burden of justification. I think there's arguments on both sides. So both sides can steel man both sides. It's just, that's how arguments work. It's this whole idea of just having to dodge and weave objections and avoid having to give arguments just isn't how the dialectic process works. And it's just not helpful. And so I think atheists do have a burden of justification. They make claims and they believe, they take it as true that God does not exist. They might, say they just lack a belief, or whatever, but no, they take those things to be false. Now, some people will insist that they're agnostics and that the question is indeterminate. I get that. I respect that position, but I also respectfully disagree. I think it is a determinate question. And I think that agnosticism is kind of the fence-sitting position. It's the way to, observe the questions without committing to either side, and to just play devil's advocate and just stay on neutral ground.
Sure. And I don't know when we want to get to him, but you have a whole there's a lot of questions got.
So let's just lump them all into. Well, first of all, we can talk about the burden of proof, but let's just lump all of those comments into just getting Ben's general idea of we'll do a quick round of just what are some popular theist arguments and what do you think are the issues with them or stuff like that. So we can just take care of all of them that way. Yeah, there you go. See, that'll just be a faster way to take care of all the.
Tangelo.
Yeah.
Yeah. So because all of those, each of those points could take forever. So we'll just do it.
Yeah. Like how do you best explain these sets of facts?
Sure, or pick a couple or all of them if you want to go quickly. But
can we put them back up on the screen?
Sure. Sorry, buddy.
So origin of the universe. So I don't know what happened at the first moments of the early universe. However, I don't think that anything about Big Bang cosmology favors theism or atheism. The laws of physics.
Can I ask a follow-up to that real fast? Sorry.
Sure.
Do you just, regardless of theism, do you think that the universe did have, and when I say universe, I don't just mean our local universe, but generally given contemporary astrophysics and cosmogony, do you think that the universe did have an absolute beginning, or do you, given just what we know so far, or?
So I'm hesitant to, what is meant by absolute beginning? So I think
time, space, and matter. There was a point when time, space, and matter did not exist, and then they came into existence, I guess would be.
Yeah. So no, I don't believe that there was this point of absolute nothingness, and then it was the case that there was something. So I don't think anything about Big Bang cosmology implies creation ex nihilo. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, I was going to say myself. It is a little sketchy once we get prior to 10 to the minus 35 seconds of the Big Bang, and I've never really liked Kalam arguments, but I got to say when I read Andrew Loke's book God and Ultimate Origins, I found that very persuasive. So I actually favor that argument now, like the origin and everything, the way Andrew Loke puts it. So,
yeah. All right. So
that's an argument I've changed my mind on. So.
Yeah.
But now, as far as the universe, like with a capital U, like all the causal things that exist, I don't know if that's eternal or finite. I don't think that that's a question that cosmology has settled.
Well, I guess I could ask Travis. Travis, are there any? Because I'm not an expert on cosmology, but to my knowledge, are there any models of the beginning of the universe currently that succeed in having a past eternal universe? Or they all have? People will point to the Bohr-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, and that does work on classical space-time,
yeah.
but we don't have a quantum theory of gravity yet. But to my knowledge, the theories that do try to do a quantum theory of gravity have like the Carol Chen, and they do have issues with the math and thermodynamics and stuff like that. So I don't know if, to my knowledge, any of them are actually successful in getting a past eternal.
All the views have issues. So that's the problem.
What was that?
All the views have issues. That's the problem. No one really knows because all the current views just have issues with it. And that even gets worse when we turn to something like quantum mechanics. I mean, I think we have something like 10 or 12, different interpretations of the exact same empirical data that, are not compatible with one another. And we don't have any way of deciding which one is right. And so it's like, that's just the problem, is we don't know which one.
Exactly.
It's too early to make a judgment. Yeah,
it's too early to make a judgment.
In fact, I'm good friends with a physicist, actually a professor of physics from Harvard, and he's told me that prior to 10 to the minus 35 seconds of the Big Bang, we don't know. So any model that we come up with is going to be speculation, and that's kind of what divides like physicists or astrophysicists from theoretical physicists. But yeah, really, we don't know. It's pretty much guesswork. I mean, there's some models that work better than others, but
we can move on. By the way, I didn't want to get caught up on this one question.
No,
that was my fault because I asked the follow up anyway. But.
So laws of physics, that's a broad thing. So I'll just say that I have the current scientific paradigm where it's think of it as Laplace's demon, the idea that if we knew any moment of the universe, we could predict future moments of the universe. And that we understand the laws of nature as necessary patterns that govern what we call cause and effect. And so I don't think that these require any sort of creator. I reject the metaphysical principle that laws require a lawgiver. Like I don't think that that's a metaphysically true principle. So I don't think that the laws of physics favor theism or atheism.
So Ben, I'm going to kind of combine this with the fine tuning because they're fairly similar arguments. But I guess the way I've heard it presented is that under theism, if God wants to create moral agents, you would predict that there would be orderly laws because you can't really have moral responsibility without some kind of consistency and knowing consequences. Whereas under naturalism, we can predict nature exists, but we have no reason to think nature would behave in any kind of predictable, orderly, because we can at least conceive of completely different laws. And so the question is, why do we have these laws and not some other laws? You could appeal to necessity, but I guess that some could say it's a taxi cab fallacy of why stop there? Why not try to explain them through some other means? And why think that they are necessary when we can imagine them as being something completely different? They're not logically necessary, at least.
Well, there's also a principle that we have to keep in mind that induces an observation selection effect. And so what do I mean? I'm talking about the Weakanthropic Principle. So it's the idea that we have to take into account the fact that we are observers and that the universe is compatible with the existence of observers. And so that biases what we're going to see. So if we're going to say that order is required for moral agency, well, the fact that what goes out and gets that piece of evidence that there is moral agency in the world, it's us. We do that. We're the observers. So everything we observe will have order. Doesn't matter what hypothesis is true. The observation has been biased because it's only observations that are conditioned on the Weakanthropic Principle are even relevant to an evidential calculus at this point, because it's a fact that we know about ourselves. It's not something that we can ignore.
Right.
Yeah, and this is where Ben and I strongly disagree, because when I look at things like the Weakanthropic Principle, it just states that, certain we have to have certain values and ratios and the constants for the possibility of simple life to evolve on a rocky planet.
But so that's a strong anthropic principle.
But the Weakanthropic Principle doesn't really tell. I mean, it doesn't tell us why it is or that it should. I mean, I don't. I think you're reading too much into the Weakanthropic Principle.
You wouldn't have
so let me give an analogy, because I don't think I'm reading too much into it, and I think the analogy will help make it clear. And so the idea is that we're using a net to fish a lake. Yeah, and so as we use the net to catch fish, we observe that all the fish we catch are greater than 10 inches. And so we think, does this observation favor the hypothesis that all the fish in the lake are greater than 10 inches, or only half the fish in the lake are greater than 10 inches? Well, it supports the hypothesis that they're all 10 inches, because all of our observations have been that. Then we notice that our net has a 10-inch hole in it. And so it'll let fish that are smaller than 10 inches swim through it. So that fact about our net has biased our observations. We will always observe fish greater than 10 inches. Our existence as observers, by the fact that the constants are right for observers, is entailed by the Weakanthropic Principle. Once we learn that fact about us, it's just like a hole in our net. We drag that fact around us, just like a net with a 10-inch hole in it. It's something that and so if you were to say, well, we can just ignore that there was a 10-inch hole in that. No, it biases our observations. The observation doesn't favor either hypothesis.
Yeah, and Ben, you and I can go back and forth on this we can spend an hour going on this, but just to kind of push back a little bit, with the Weakanthropic Principle, and like even your analogy with the net, it's not telling us why it is the case. And my thing is, like, we have all these perimeters for a life permitting universe, but it doesn't stop there. It keeps growing through the solar system, through the planetary systems, the planet, the moon, life on the planet's surface, and it just keeps going in its goal directed towards moral agency. And I think that shows a state of intentionality.
So the question I have here is, you're saying that, why is this the case? Well, when we're talking about evidence, I can give you why something is the case by describing it probabilistically, by saying that, this is the case because it was more likely. Well, now, by this observation selection effect undermines that probabilistic reasoning. So if you're going to say, well, why is it like this? It's not for some probabilistic reason. It's for some other reason. You must be making some other sort of assumption. And so we have to examine that assumption. How are you conferring a probability on that observation? And so it seems to me like you want to say that, well, God wants moral agents. Right?
Right, and so what I'm doing, it's intentionality. It has it's an inference to the best explanation, and I think the intentionality offers that explanatory power, and it can be independently tested through the increasing teleological precision that goes well beyond just the life-permitting universe. But I'm afraid you and I are going to get stuck on this, so I'll just concede whatever else.
Yeah. Do you?
We can move on to because that takes us past fine tuning. The origin of life. Again, I don't know. I don't know how life began. I believe that it was by natural processes that were biochemical in nature. However, I don't know what that complete story looks like. I don't think anyone knows what that complete story looks like. Common ancestry.
I actually agree with Ben on this, by the way. I don't think biodiversity is abiogenesis is a very compelling argument, because if given the Earth is so old and you have so many chemical reactions going on for billions of years, I think you could say that you're bound to get something eventually.
But what's interesting though is in the early Earth science, that as soon as the oxygen levels rose to like the adequate amount, like within time span of like 10 million years, we had life, and that's really brief for something like that.
Yeah.
So
But
I don't know. I'm kind of open about it.
yeah, but it's also
I
the
don't-
idea of so if God needs to fine tune the universe to create life, then he's doing it through natural processes. So why would God need to do all these natural things, but then miraculously create life, right? So I don't think it's unexpected that given fine tuning, God would also have life arise through these same natural laws, because then it just seems like, well, why even bother with the fine tuning if you're just going to snap your fingers and poof it into existence anyway? So I just don't think it's
Well, the way I was taught, in Reasons to Believe, they teach us that there's like different ways that God interacts with the world, like ordinary providence, extraordinary providence, and transcendent action, and that he does certain things because he wants to, like an artist. So, and we're going from, I remain open on the origin of life.
Yeah.
I don't know.
So 5 and 6 are common ancestry and biodiversity. And so I'll just say biological evolution via natural selection. So I think that what explains common ancestry is biological evolution by natural selection. What explains biodiversity is the same set of principles. So I think both common ancestry and biodiversity favor atheism over theism. So why do I think that? Because I think special creation would have favored theism over atheism. So if I think that an intentional process would favor a design, the other side of that coin is that I think a mindless chance process like biological evolution favors atheism over theism. So I think 5 and 6 are actually evidence for atheism over theism.
I would agree. Yeah. I don't know why those were brought up, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm a theistic evolutionist myself. I think there's a teleology within the evolutionary process, but I don't think it's a very and I don't think he was trying to go there. So yeah.
So 7 is consciousness and has to do also with the the observation selection effect that I mentioned in fine tuning and the laws of physics. So the Weakanthropic Principle also implies the existence of conscious observers. So we are guaranteed by the Weakanthropic Principle to observe conscious observers. This also undermines the argument on the other side. Some atheists would like to say the material world is evidence against theism. No, the Weakanthropic Principle implies that observers with material bodies will observe matter. So I don't think consciousness or matter favor either atheism or theism. Something similar can be said about objective moral values. I think objective moral values exist, but they're necessary truths. So they're true in every possible world. They're true given every theory, or given either theory, whether it's atheism or theism. So I'm what's called an ethical non-naturalist.
Right.
So I believe that some things matter because we have reasons to care about these things for their own sake, and that these reason-implying truths are necessary truths.
I have a question. Since you're a Hegelian, would you say something like the universe is rational and morality is a rational enterprise, and so it just kind of gives rise to that?
Well, so I would say that the world has a rational structure. And so that's
Right.
why it gave rise to beings like us that are rational, that can similarly then turn our attention and understand itself. So I don't think that what I mean by the world is rational is what I'm trying to avoid comes from Kant. So unfortunately, you can't understand what I'm about to say about Kant unless you've read Hume. I'm sorry, this is just how philosophy works. But so Hume famously was worried about having knowledge of the external world. And so Kant, and having, knowledge from the experience and then knowledge from our intuitions. And so Kant famously came along and tried to synthesize a priori knowledge and a posteriori knowledge by intuition and knowledge by experience. And so, but he had these leftover things in themselves. He said that, look, we can know everything in the phenomenal realm, but there's this noumenal realm that we can't know anything about. It's just this part of the world that is just forever beyond rationality. And so that's a very unsatisfying view that raises other issues. And so Hegel comes along and says, no, the world is rational all the way through. If it's the case that you know something, it's because you know the world in and of itself. It's not just an impression that's being put on your senses from this, noumenal realm, impressing itself on a phenomenal realm. No, it's just the world is rational between, and so on this view, the distinction between subject and object disappears. Right. Subject and object are concepts we impose on the world. And right. So when I say the world is rational, there is no fundamental difference between the structure of thought that constitutes how the world is in and of itself and the kinds of thoughts we can have in our minds that understand things in and for themselves.
Can I say something on this? I know that Ben wanted to organize a discussion based on theodicy and the moral argument sometime, which I know we're still working on getting. But so I think as far as the moral argument, as far as the way I say it and that I understand it, is that we can perceive that there is value in the universe of certain things. And value is different amongst different objects. So if you were to chop up a tree with an axe, most people would not care, well, other than hippies. But if you were to chop up a baby with an axe, then you've done something morally wrong. And so I think it's kind of like Aquinas when you look at why are there different levels of value of things, Because even if we're talking about Platonism, in the mathematical world, everything has numerical value, whether or not it realizes it. We just observe that. But why is it that humans and persons seem to be of the highest sense of value and seem to be the most important, whereas non-humans don't? And it seems like it's arbitrary to posit this is just a brute fact, because why would one set of atoms and one set of biochemical reactions that give us emotions be any more valuable than any other set of biochemical reactions? So it seems to me that it's a bit arbitrary. And I guess the second one would be that it also seems that given finitism, given that ultimately everything will die and the universe will be destroyed, no consequentialism just goes out the window, and it doesn't seem like anything really matters at that point at all. Now you could advocate deontology and say that it still matters, but that just seems like it's begging the question to me as to why it should. So I guess those are partially why I have issue with most naturalistic models. I guess you said yours wasn't naturalistic, but most non-theistic models of morality, because I just don't think that they really are coherent and from what I can see at least.
Well, so I want to take each of those objections in turn. So the first one asks us the moral difference between something like a baby and a tree, and why it would be wrong to use something like an axe towards the baby, but it wouldn't be wrong in a moral sense to use the axe towards something like a tree. We have to provide some reason why there's a moral difference here. So this is a basic thought experiment question in moral philosophy that you would put this sort of question to first year philosophy students that were just starting in to think about moral questions, because answers vary through the moral traditions. So there's a utilitarian consequentialist tradition that says the capacity to feel pain. So Jeremy Bentham, John Stuart Mill famously put forward these sorts of arguments that the capacity to feel pain is what is the moral difference between the axe on the tree and on the baby. There's a Kantian deontological tradition that says, we're rational animals because of the fact that we have this capacity of rationality. We have an inherent dignity that should be respected categorically. And so that's the moral difference. And then there's a contractualist tradition that says that, look, this is what we owe to each other. We have, as the natures as rational animals, we owe things to each other. We don't owe things to other trees. Or if we do, they're in much more limited senses because they're not rational. So these are three different traditions that try to answer the normative question of what's the moral difference between a baby and a tree. And so I think we can answer one of those traditions at least gives us a plausible answer to that question. Now, what was the second objection?
I think it was about like moral nihilism and everything being ultimately meaningless.
Well, so I think you're confusing moral nihilism with existential nihilism.
Yes,
So
thank
this
you.
idea that
Yeah.
so existential nihilism being this idea that the world doesn't have an inherent purpose to it. It's the world is not for something. It's not a tool that has some telos or some way in which it should be used or has some goal that it's striving towards. So I just don't think that it follows that because things don't matter on this cosmic, ultimate life after death sense, that things don't matter full stop. My wife still matters to me, my child matters to me, my family, my friends, knowledge matters. And none of that changes when I know that the universe is going to die in a heat death 15 billion years in the future. I don't think that non-normative fact about the universe has any normative implications for value in the world that is relevant to our everyday lives. So that's how I would respond to those two objections. I would just say that I think moral philosophy has ready responses to these worries. That there's traditions that try to answer these questions in satisfying and substantive ways.
Yeah, just as a quick, I don't want to make this a whole debate. So I want to say something on this, and then I had one more question to add on to this list of things, unless Travis wants to say something. But I guess what the thing that still I inquire about is that it doesn't seem to me that like being, you said feeling pain, which of course is an important thing, but pain is still just any other, is a biochemical reaction, just like we have helium interacting with other elements and stuff like that. So I don't see why we should be arbitrarily picking certain chemical reactions over other chemical
It does have a
reactions.
normative significance. So like what it's like to be burnt or whipped has this feature of counting in favor of me not wanting to be in this situation. So like I think that this is one of those features of the world that is different than just say, a chemical reaction in a high school chemistry lab.
Well, you said not wanting, though. Is that almost sounds like you're implying a motivism? Is it just I don't like this particular reaction, and that's why it's unfavorable?
Well, so no, I'm an objectivist. So it's the idea that what it's like to be burnt or whipped, the what it's likeness of being in pain, not any particular person's pain, the nature of pain has this normative property of counting in favor of our responding to it in negative ways or ways of avoiding it. We all have reason to want to avoid future agony, is the claim.
Sure, but I guess saying that we have reason to doesn't follow that it actually is. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I guess it just seems to me like it's picking because it's
well, yeah. So I mean, we have to start our normative intuition somewhere. And so I think things like evidence count in favor of believing things. And so I think that things that are painful count in favor of not doing them. And so I think those are just basic intuitions that if we were to encounter a situation that required us to deny them, we would just go, well, that's just absurd. Like any implication that would require me to, say that it's not irrational to try to eat a car, that's that's just going to be a view that's not true.
Well, yeah, but I guess I think we both agree on the observation. I think it's just the interpretation of saying, yes, we both agree that it is, but it seems like
one for sure. It
seems it's a bit ad hoc, I guess. Yeah.
Well, so this is deep meta-ethical landscape. So, I mean, there are competing views here. The non-naturalist view that I subscribe to is not the only game in town. Like you mentioned emotivism earlier, and so that's a non-cognitivist view. There's ethical naturalists. There's people that try to reduce morality to natural facts, which I think is impossible. There's subjectivists, people that are ethical constructivists that just say, look, morality is like our rules of etiquette. We just respond to them much more deeper than we do our rules of etiquette. And so that we construct these moral systems, and that's why they vary over time and place and why they change, things get better when the constructed ethical system becomes more coherent and includes more people. I disagree with that view, but that's a view.
Okay, thank you. So I guess the next, I don't know, Travis, do you want to say anything before we move on? I was going to move on from the moral questions. We've talked about it for a while now, but you're muted.
My thoughts, just briefly on the moral argument, is for the most part, I've always rejected or not found it compelling. But the reason why I would kind of lean towards it now is like from simple unification. I think like the principles of reason, morality, the ontology of the laws of logic can all be grounded in a rational mind, and so I kind of go that route with morality.
Yeah, I don't know, I guess it just seems like reason is also an arbitrary, natural force. That's like, why should we put more favor?
Reason?
Yeah, well, it seems
So
principle of reason.
when you say reason is arbitrary, so something is arbitrary, then it's not in accordance with reason. So
no, arbitrary in that it's like not anymore. It's the universe is indifferent to whether or not reasonable agents will ever exist or not, right? That's more so what I mean. Why should
so there's a difference between reason, like the truth that is out there and the capacity that we've evolved to comprehend reason. So I think reason is the least arbitrary thing you could have, just by definition. If you see what I'm saying, like if something is a reason.
Yeah, but I don't mean like ontological. I meant reason as in like our ability to reason, I guess.
That's
is
fair.
What I meant. Yeah.
So you're saying that there's a problem with the reliability of our reasoning faculties.
Or you could just say it seems like a coincidence that we happen to evolve faculties that are able to see these moral truths. That it seems like it could have been very. I mean, for most of the universe.
No, that's fair. That's fair. That's an evolutionary debunking argument. And so
somebody brought up a question about that too.
Yeah, so an evolutionary debunking argument says that look, the having reliable knowledge of moral truths doesn't have survival advantage. And so I just disagree with these people. I just don't think that that's the case. I think that we were selected for our rational capacities. So giraffes were selected for long necks, cheetahs were selected for speed, we were selected for rationality. And our ability to reason has allowed us to discover moral truths, and knowledge of basic moral truths, reliable knowledge of basic moral truths, does have survival advantage.
That actually
allows for better.
Sorry, that's one more. I didn't want to keep doing this, but you brought up one more thing I was going to say earlier that I forgot. And
Fair enough. Go ahead.
But it was the idea that I talk about this in the book a little bit of that. If we're talking about based on survival, it seems to me that when you talk about human well-being, if you actually look as far as populations go, countries that have higher birth rates typically have worse off standards of living than ones who don't. So it doesn't seem to me that you can get. It seems to me that if you're going to just focus on what's going to produce the most genes, and as far as evolutionary goes, all that matters in survival is how much you can reproduce your genes, right?
No, I don't think that what matters is how much you can produce your genes. I think so. Well-being consists of much more than that.
No, I know that, but I'm saying in terms of evolution, I don't think it really matters because.
We're not. So evolution might not care, but evolution is a mindless process.
That's debatable.
But isn't that what's being selected though? Is our ability to reproduce? Isn't that what's contingent? What our ability to reason is contingent on?
No. So our ability to reason is contingent on our being able to survive long enough in order to reproduce, pass on genes to within a population, so that then through transgenerational mutations, you have enough gene frequency in a population to select for adaptive traits. And so one of those adaptive traits, I think, is the capacity to reason. So It's the capacity that allows us to play chess and write poetry and discover calculus. Do I think that we were selected to play chess or invent calculus or write poetry? No. I think that that's just a consequence of biological evolution, is that we got rational faculties. Those rational faculties allowed us to apprehend basic moral truths. Having knowledge of basic moral truths allowed us to cooperate better in societies. That's why we thrive and we live in cities and societies and in groups, because we were able to figure out how to morally cooperate with one another.
So do you think that over time, if those who have worse well-being will be able to out reproduce those who do not? Do you think evolution will favor that in the long run?
So I don't.
I mean, like
know.
countries like countries that have higher birth rates that are like, you know, India and stuff that are
It's not even clear to me that the mechanisms of natural selection are even influencing our gene populations anymore. So that might be something that we've turned off at this point. Like we might have bested evolution, and
so evolution
there
outdid
might not
itself.
be.
So evolution gave us faculties where we could actually beat out evolution itself, which we got through evolution.
Perhaps it might be there might be a stage of development of a society in which you go, okay, there's no longer pressures that would force selection of certain traits over other traits. And so you could imagine this as something like Kant's, kingdom of ends, where everyone is acting for everyone's own and everyone else's own deserved happiness. And so that this is just that kind of world. If you could resolve all of your moral disagreements and live in that sort of world, you wouldn't have something like natural selection acting on that gene population in ways that, you're competing, and that there's certain gene populations that are being sifted and winnowed out of the population at that point. Everything is just uniformly chance at that point.
Okay.
So biological evolution requires non-uniform chance. You wipe that non-uniform chance out and you just have uniform noise.
Gotcha. So Travis, I'll let you, if you want to say something about that. I was going to ask like one or two more questions before. I don't know how long you want to go, by the way, but I have this room for like another 20 or 30 minutes, but I don't want to keep it all day. So.
Oh, I was just going to push back on his arguments with evolution, but I can put that aside.
Well, it's fine. I'm probably going to head out in like 28 minutes or so, but if you want to keep going, I'll be it to you. You can talk. I don't want to cut you off.
Yeah.
Okay.
We were going to go about an hour, so it's fine.
We're at 58 minutes, but that's fine. It's whatever. We can talk after this as well, but we can have a follow-up episode. We have all kinds of ideas. But no, the other one so the ones I would have added to the list of theistic arguments that I'm surprised weren't on there because I think they're underrated. And I guess I can just get your thoughts on them. The first one was the one that I was mentioning at the very beginning about this sense perception of the divine, right? I call it SPAT, sensory perception argument for theism. The idea that we have eyes that can see light, we have ears that can hear sound, we have a sensus divinitatis, and because we trust our other senses, we should just default accept that this is accurate in perceiving something that exists, unless we have a defeater given otherwise. So that's the first one. Actually, I'll let you address that before I move on to the other one, so I don't.
That's
forget.
a good question.
Yeah. So that's great. So I think there is such a defeater, and I think the defeater comes in the form of the argument from divine hiddenness. So I think that the idea that there are non-resistant non-theists is a defeater for the idea that there's this faculty, this divine faculty of divinity that we're calling a sensus divinitatis. I just don't think we have that faculty. So that just doesn't feature among the faculties that we have, and that we can justify that with the argument from divine hiddenness.
So you actually agree that the argument would be good if there was no defeaters, but there are defeaters, and so if there were defeaters, it would be rational.
I think so. I'll go ahead and admit though that I'm not an epistemologist. My interests to epistemology have always kind of been secondary, but I know, and I haven't decided between internal and externalism.
Right. I don't think this argument presupposes either, by the way, because they're
Yeah. So it's just one of those things. It's one of those things. I don't know where I am on it. I know that there's this idea that beliefs can be properly basic, and that we can defeat certain. We can't just say any belief is properly basic. There are ways to defeat it, and so that seems like if you're trying to put forward a plausible theory of epistemology, it seems like a plausible theory of epistemology. So I don't have any in principle objections to it, but I do think that there are defeaters for the idea that there's a sensus divinitatis.
Okay. Well, I guess it wouldn't be defeaters for the sensus divinitatis. It'd be defeaters that it's functional. You could say we have it, but it's just for survival and it's not accurate. But I think empirically that's independent of the question of whether or not it works, because we can observe and create religious experiences using the brain and stuff like that. So I don't think that's in question, given the science. I think it's just saying, is this trustworthy or not? But that's
fair enough.
Second. Okay, yeah. And the second one was going to be in the comments a little bit. I'm writing a whole book on this though, so this is kind of one of my favorites. One is the argument from miracles, and I know you like to talk about Hume and stuff, but before we deconstruct that, I would also like to say that I think Hume's argument is, even if we get into the philosophy behind it, it does seem to me that this is hard because I don't see this brought up a lot because most philosophers are not qualified to talk about medicine and history, and a lot of that is involved in science. But even now we have, when you have things like MRIs and X-rays, it's a lot harder to dismiss things like that, because when you have photography, Hume couldn't even imagine cameras and stuff nowadays. When you have in Egypt, in 1960 something, where tens of thousands of people think they can see the Virgin Mary, and we actually have photographs of this, or we have MRIs of people's entire bones growing back and brains and so forth. I just think that's Hume's objection gets more and more outdated, and I think a lot of people just haven't looked at the science. And I think you can look at so many cases where medically it is extremely hard to give a natural explanation. And of course we can say, but we can't infer theism. But I think certainly even if you had a case where an amputee grew a leg back instantly after prayer, which we do have at least once in history, it would be hard to not to at least be given a little bit of pause, I think, as a naturalist. But I don't know what you want to say to that.
Do you want me to say something to miracles more generally, or to the point you just made?
Whichever you prefer.
Fair enough. I want to try to do them both, so help me try to remember. So I take a straightforward, commonsensical approach to miracles, and I say that when considering evidence of testimony for a miracle, we have to ask ourselves a question. Have the laws of nature been deviated from in favor of some religious group or ideology, or some other mistake that's been made that's consistent with the laws of nature? And so I think that we can talk about miracles without ever mentioning Hume. So Hume is obviously an important figure in the discussion about miracles. And I think that there is an interpretation of his argument that just straightforwardly fits within current probability theory. And so I think that we can just straightforwardly say that if it's more likely that the evidence of testimony in support of a miracle event is false, then we should not believe it. And that it's more likely the evidence of testimony in support of a miracle event is false, and so therefore we should not believe miracle events based on evidence of testimony. And I think that that's just a straightforward implication of probability theory. And so basically it's saying that, look, the evidence of testimony that we have in favor of the laws of nature is really, really, really good. And the empirical evidence that we have for the reliability of evidence of testimony of a religious nature is really, really bad. This is a really, really bad track record. So any evidence for a miracle just has to outweigh those two factors. And we just don't. So the evidence that we need for a miracle is just not the evidence that we have. We just have these very, very, very powerful considerations that just make it more likely that some other mistake has been made. So that's what I would say generally about miracles. Now you asked a more particular question, and of course now it's lost my mind. What was your more particular question?
I gave a couple examples, and I said, but with like photographs and videos and medical and modern medical like MRIs, does that not also make testimony relevant?
Yeah, and you also said, so I know that one of the common internet atheist lines is, why doesn't God heal amputees? And so I take it that the intuition here is that if people did just heal spontaneous, that would count in favor of God. I'm going to say I don't know. I don't know what a God would want in that situation. I don't know how we would decide. I don't know how we would justify, independently motivate the assumption that God would want people to regrow amputees or not. I just that,
Do you think it's
that to
more
me
likely under theism than naturalism that would happen?
Maybe. So I'm trying to think of an antecedent reason why. So I guess you could say that disability is bad, and that God is perfectly good. And so that if God had the opportunity to, he had the power to eliminate a disability, then that means he could eliminate a disability. And if he was perfectly good, then he would have the motivation to eliminate a disability. And so he would eliminate a disability. And so if you make all of those assumptions, then I think you can say that the observation, would favor one hypothesis or another. But those are all assumptions that have to be independently. We can't just assume whatever we want. That's not how probability works.
Right.
Probability are a set of laws that only govern a certain set of assumptions. And so you have to be very explicit about what assumptions you're building into this probability judgment that's going to be conferring a probability on a hypothesis.
Right, but traditionally miracles are not just the idea. I mean, granted, yes, God does want to heal sick people, but if that was the case, then he could heal every sick person if he wanted to. I think the whole point of it is it's supposed to vindicate a message, and that's why miracles are
absolutely. It's got to be some sort of sign. So now I think you're hitting on the head. So if you're going to say that a miracle is evidence for theism, then it has to be because you're assuming that this miracle is some sort of sign, that it's going to communicate some sort of religiously important message. So if miracles just happened all the time, you would never be able to communicate a religiously important message because it would just be lost in all the noise. It would just be an ordinary event. It's because it's extraordinary that it's got this feature that can communicate a religious significance.
Correct. Right. So I think we both agree on that point. But yeah, I guess it just depends on, and I guess going back to testimony, I think we need to be careful because realistically, most of our epistemology is based on testimony because we as creatures have very narrow ways of associating.
Absolutely, but not all testimony is created equal. So the testimony for the laws of nature and the testimony for the reliability of other religious testimony is very good. So we know that there are a lot of bad, a lot of phony religious claims, a lot of phony religious testimony, a lot of nefarious and sometimes innocently mistaken religious testimony for miracle events of a religious nature.
Sure, but I guess that also is asking why. I mean, you did answer that a little bit of why is religion the exception? Why can't we say someone making extraordinary claims in the scientific, like we can observe natural laws, and when someone like
we do. So we have conspiracy theorists. We have we say that look, you're making an extraordinary claim. There's a lot of evidence against this. You've got to put so like if someone were to say, I have a perpetual motion machine. That doesn't, I don't think that has any theological implications to it, but it does violate the second law of thermodynamics. Well, the second law of thermodynamics is very, very, very well established. So if you're going to say that you have a perpetual motion machine, you have to have some sort of experiment that's going to be able to outweigh all of that evidence of testimony that you have in favor.
So
that you have if that's impossible.
Would you have to see it yourself, or if there was a panel of 200 scientists who published a paper saying that we saw this and we peer-reviewed it, would you trust them?
So you would obviously, that would be a virtue if you were able to do some sort of study that had multiple witnesses, and so that the evidence was shared. So that if it's
right,
I don't know if you've ever seen the movie Contact.
I have not.
Like Jodie Foster's character in the movie. They spend billions of dollars to do this science experiment, and she's the only one that experiences anything. And so they're like, well, what kind of results does she have? All we have is her story. And so what the lesson of that is that if that extraordinary experience that she had during this experiment was able to be viewed by multiple people, it would have been taken more seriously in that movie's, the situation that the movie had set up for, because most people are just like, oh, well, this was a failed experiment. We wasted our time.
So both of us agree that having the more witnesses you have, the better, right?
The more witnesses you have, the better. Yes.
Okay. I think we both agree with that. Yeah.
You want their testimony to be more or less the same rather than to conflict or contradict. You
Right.
want, certain criteria. If we were to say that there was a miracle event, the evidence of testimony that we would have in its favor would look something much more like a science experiment on the size and scale of something like the Large Hadron Collider. Like, it would be a massive endeavor that would put forward evidence of testimony that would just rival anything. You could make very, very improbable claims, and you would be justified in making them because the evidence of testimony would just be so, so, so powerful. We don't have anything like that from historical methods. Historical methods just don't have the epistemic reach that something like the methods underpinning something like the Large Hadron Collider.
So how many of these have you actually looked into? Because I think people say that, but like, have you looked into every claim to make that decision, or are you just more generalizing that, saying, well,
no? So it's been a little while now, but I've read some of the philosophical works on miracles themselves, and so within them they gave examples that were, by their claims, the best examples within the current literature for a miracle claim. Now, I don't know their methodology behind that. I don't know how they went about to determine whether or not those were the ones. But they went through them and more or less gave other plausible explanations or ways in which some other mistake might have been made.
Okay. I just thought that was interesting because like most of the ones that I'm familiar with, I can't think of. I mean, you can say that it's medically inexplicable, but I don't think, unless you just want to say that all the doctors are lying and stuff. But I'm trying to wrap this up. But going
certainly saying medically explicable, I think it's saying I don't know in a lot of the situations is the most appropriate response.
Sure, and that depends if it was in a religious context or not, right? Because if you're praying for God to intercede to heal a person and the person's healed, then you can say maybe God was the agent because you have reasons to think that's the case. Whereas if there was no prayer, then it'd be harder to make that judgment. But especially if it was something that only God could do, like at least that we know. If it's something we should not expect.
So we do have empirical studies that for something like intercessory prayer. So like praying for people that are that actually made a lot of things worse.
You're talking about the Benson study, you're talking about the Templeton study?
I believe that's what it is.
Yeah. There's other studies, and there was the criticism, but there's studies on both sides that I have, which you can have. The Mayo Clinic did one, so I'm not trying to get into all that. But granted, I don't think we can predict who God will heal and who God will not heal. But I do think what you can say is that like we can try to falsify naturalistic explanation. So if someone was healed, we don't know how, and we propose a naturalistic explanation, we can test that. If the natural explanation fails, then we can at least say we have no plausible naturalistic mechanism to explain this. So now that might be as far as you can go. But historically, what you were talking about, like when I talked about the amputee one earlier, the one Hume actually mentions this case, but that one I thought was interesting because you had a man who was amputated. He was a beggar for two and a half years, and this is in the 17th century, by the way, in Spain. He was amputated for He had been amputated for 2 years. He was seen by everyone as a beggar. One night he had a dream that the Virgin Mary rubbed his leg with holy oil. He wakes up and his leg is back. There was an inquiry that lasted for a whole year of officials trying to get witnesses. They interviewed the doctors who amputated the leg. They interviewed all the people. They compared the leg. They looked at the new leg, and the new leg had the same scars as the old leg. They went to the cemetery where they had buried the first leg, and that leg was gone. And this was seen by both enemies and people who were against it. And in 1950, we exhumed the grave, and we were able to look, and we were able to see that one of the legs was in fact shorter, and the bone had calcified and looked like it had been damaged at one point. It healed again. So while that doesn't prove indefinitely, I think that's a pretty rigorous. I can't think of any explanation other than saying literally everyone was lying, because you can't really be mistaken about someone missing a leg, right? I don't think a doctor could be sincerely mistaken about cutting a guy's leg off and seeing that the leg is back. And the fact that I think the description of the leg was actually consistent with leg replantations of today, even though this happened in the 17th century when they didn't know about stuff like that. So that for me is a really compelling example of like a very rigorous investigation of a claim like that. But
Fair enough.
okay, that's fair. That's all I had. But Travis, if you wanted to close the show out with
Yeah. So my thoughts on I don't really have too much to say on miracles. I'm both intrigued and very skeptical at the same time.
That's fair. That's a good approach to be. Honestly, you should be
Yeah.
because you don't want to fall short. And there's more that I disbelieve than I believe, so I try to be careful. And I think what we said earlier is having criteria is important.
Yes.
How many witnesses were there? How long after the events was this written down? Were there any hostile witnesses? Were this only people who wanted to believe? Is there any medical confirmation? All those are relevant to the question, right? So.
Right. So I want to be skeptical, but not closed-minded. I want to be open to the evidence like that. But anyway, yeah, I thought it was really great having Ben on, and we kind of wanted to show, how this differs from like a lot of the, bashing of the two camps, like, with a lot of internet atheists and everything, and how, we demonstrated how theists and atheists can have meaningful conversation. Like, even though we disagree on so much, we're able to talk about it reasonably and rationally and everything. And that's one thing I really admire about Ben and what they're doing.
Productively, I hope. I know Caleb's writing another book. I've read a little bit of his last book, but I hope I've helped at least give some little nuggets of insight to help in the writing process.
Thanks. Yeah, no, I appreciate it. Well, hopefully I'll let you read the miracle one, but it's probably gonna be very long. It might be 600 pages, so we'll see.
Oh wow! Yeah.
It'll be.
Hey man, could you proof this? Could you proofread this for me?
Yeah, if you want to
real
proofread it. I need editors because I don't want to edit the whole thing myself. So yeah. Appreciate it.
Okay, so Ben, I thought to close out, we do. What is your favorite argument for theism and your favorite argument for atheism?
So I would say my favorite argument for theism is the argument from moral agency. So I think it's the best argument for theism. I think it's one that stops and gives me pause and says, okay, this is one way in which the evidence could go. And I think that it's something that we should concede to theists. My favorite argument for atheism is probably the argument from divine hiddenness. I think the argument from evil is the most powerful argument, and I think the argument from hiddenness might just be another form of the argument from evil. But I just find the discussion around the argument from divine hiddenness super, super interesting. And I think it takes the concept of a perfectly loving being very, very seriously. And so I really liked it for that reason, just because it gets you thinking very, very seriously about a God.
Right.
All right. Well, I think with that, we will wrap the show. Ben, thank you so much for coming on. You're always welcome on again. Hopefully we can schedule something else sometime, but this was fun. So yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much for having me on, and thanks for asking such great questions and having such a great conversation with me.
All right. Take care.
All right. Take care.